What will the world look like after the revolution? What is the future that we are fighting to build? These are the kinds of questions that are commonly put on anybody who professes to be against the system in general, who wants to outgrow the system or overturn the system or transform the system or revolt against the system. Any of this language, any of those rhetorics indicates to the normal person that you must think you have a better idea. And that's why they always ask, so what's your plan? What's your blueprint? Lay it on us so that we can idly sit by and problematize it. And, I don't hold that against anybody, because I think that when you're asking people to put not just their entire life at risk, but everyone that they know, to potentially alienate themselves from everyone else and potentially have to fight loved ones, who knows, even in a bloody war, that's very concerning. I would be very concerned. If a loved one came to me saying, I'm entertaining some pretty radical ideas lately, I'd be like, yeah, I hope you're not writing a manifesto and going to go shoot up a school or something like that, right? Like, it's concerning. Extremism, when it's just an individual in some town somewhere, is tuned in with the spirit of the times through like their echo chamber online. It's not like in touch with the spirit of the times in the populace where you physically are. And so to the people who aren't consuming the same media as you're going to seem utterly ridiculous. They might not be, maybe they don't even believe in climate change. Maybe they totally think that the constant debate between carbon tax and cap and trade is like somehow like the sort of reformist approach is going to be able to address that. But for me, before I got into philosophy, I had seen that documentary, The Venus Project, which if you've seen Zeitgeist 3, then you saw some of the stuff about Venus Project in there. I'll link that in the description. Basically, there's this futurist, Jacques Fresco, who he's a cute old man who is like a jack of all trades. Polymath is the fancy way of saying a person who studies a lot of the different sciences and maths. But in reality, I don't know how much science he studies. I'm assuming he studies plenty of science, but I don't think he studies any philosophy. I don't think he studies any political philosophy. I don't think he studies any critical theory. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. But I generally agree with his sentiment that he's like, this shit has got to go. And basically, he realized when he was 12, I think this is during the Great Depression, that, all of the resources are still there. But because of the existing political, bureaucratic, economic setup, arrangement, we're not able to get the things we need. And that's a problem. It's all there, but we're not able to get the stuff we need. Seems like something that's supposed to be useful is instead being counterproductive, and it's actually hurting us. And so Jacques Fresco set himself to designing cities of the future. I will talk a lot more about cities of the future and some of the problems that come along with the administrative, colonizing, imperial gaze that would, use high modern science, or at least high modern sentiments, to try to construct the world for others. I don't think that it's inherently problematic for people to be future oriented like this and for us to be having those kinds of conversations. There's just important stuff to keep in mind. Now, because that was kind of my point of entry into politics, to be honest, before I'd ever studied political philosophy, it seemed transparently like a good idea. I didn't know why the existing parties weren't talking about these things. So I imagine that I would have been more into Andrew Yang than anyone else if I was, let's say, 19, and because at the age of 19 I hadn't ever read political philosophy, I hadn't really studied any of the things that I've studied at this point. I would have just been like, automation and the fact that the future seems foreclosed due to the fact that prices keep going up, we're renting more and more, and automation's on the rise. Like, I would have seen that as like the number one issue, and I would want people to be addressing it, because obviously that's going to affect everybody, especially the most marginalized, who are forced to migrate, who are forced to leave due to capitalism's uneven development. Okay, so this has been for me the reason I was most attracted to progressive politics in the first place, is because progressives at least like talk a lot about the future, or at least like they're future oriented. Even if they're not talking a lot about the future, at least they're future oriented, I thought. But I mean, in real life, most people aren't. And so what I instead found myself doing was reading thinkers who are more future oriented. So that was my initial attraction to Marx, for instance, was to understand what are the structural conditions that led to the rise of capitalism from feudalism, and how does that live on today, and what are the biggest issues, the real fucking heart and nerves of like the entire system. When we're talking about changing things, where do we have to really lean in? What do we really want to focus on if we're talking about moving towards a world that is post-exploitation, post-expropriation, where we're not taking the world's resources in a way where they're not renewable, where we're not utilizing the labor of people seen as lesser than human, where we're not undercompensating people for their contributions into projects as like a necessary component of profiteering. What would that future end up looking like? And so when people ask me, what's the future supposed to look like after the revolution? I'm like, well, I don't even know that like a big bloody, civil war or something like that is necessarily going to get us there. And that's why I'm not a full-on revolutionary. I guess I would want to see what plans people have to put forward. For me, you can't blueprints, the idea of like having it all figured out in advance. The big problem with that, and I know I'm not the first person to say it, is that it excludes democratic participation. So instead, what I would prefer is a world where it becomes normalized for us to be talking about, well, what do we want our city to look like in 10 years, in 50 years, in 100 years? And for that to be a conversation people get initiated into just as a part of their education. And I think that Murray Bookchin, someone who was an anarchist but became what he called a communalist over time, spent the latter half of his life really thinking about, and I haven't read enough of him yet, but there'll be more on that in the future. For now, I'll just say that my answer to the question almost always is like, look, I'll just use examples. I think we transform existing institutions. We take places like border cities and actual border points and turn those into sanctuary cities. We turn those into education and work training and relocation resource points where anybody can go if they need to transition and they need to start again. And it's a place where they can go and get the training to while finding like the place that they're going to plug into next. Because relocation is going to be a lot more important going forward because of the uneven development of capitalism and the variable climate intensification and unstable weather condition intensifications of accelerating climate change. So migration and transition points is one of the first things I usually talk about because freedom of movement is material freedom. Most other kinds of freedom are kind of lofty and ideological, but when it comes to freedom of movement, being able to leave a place that is no longer safe, that is the number one, first and foremost kind of freedom. And I get that from Hannah Arendt, and she knew intimately because she was a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany who came to the U.S. So the last thing I'll say is that I fight for a world where everyone has more time, energy, and attention to share with and to pool with their loved ones and communities of potential recognition or concern or care. I believe in a world where we prioritize time, energy, and attention over money, and we prioritize people over profit and planet. And yeah, I could spend the next 12 hours unpacking that, but instead I'll probably just come back to this topic a few times in my next few roadside rants. Probably in between some of those next few ones, I'll also obviously just be responding to timely issues. But Damon Garcia put this on my radar because someone was asking him, and it's always an interesting question. And I did do a live stream with Ann Tifa, my partner, that is accessible to patrons in the patron-only unlisted playlist. I think it's the one called Training Antifa Super Soldiers of the Future, where we talk about lots of our ideas about the future. And it's not that we have the right ideas, it's just that we think that this kind of thinking needs to be popularized in general, because as Mark Fisher says, neoliberalism is the foreclosure of the future. Capitalist realism, the idea that there is no alternatives to the existing status quo, is the death of art. It's the death of imagination. It's the death of having any kind of a future-oriented purpose that could make living life on Earth more meaningful than the bare minimum pursuit of either survival or of, individual profit. So, keep it future-oriented, y'all. Has anybody else seen the Venus Project? Has anybody else ever thought much about what the future is going to look like? Is anybody in here a techno enthusiast, or is anyone in here super concerned about that strain of progressive imagination? Do let me know in the comments below. Also, I haven't been saying this in my roadside rants recently, but I need to. My patrons are awesome. They keep me going. Thank you so much. Do look in the description for links and all that jazz. Take care.